everyone, and welcome back. I have been going down yet another rabbit hole looking into 1920s undergarments while working on what is essentially going to be an entire trousseau of lingerie for an upcoming trip, and I thought it'd be a good time to look at the evolution of underwear really throughout the last 500 years, because that's what I've got in my closet. But before we get into our time machine and travel all the way back to the 15th century, there are a few things that I need to cover. First and foremost, myself. A lot of this underwear is not exactly great with coverage, so I am going to be wearing things underneath of all of it, so that way this can be up on YouTube. In reality, all of what you're going to see wouldn't have had other things beneath it unless I mentioned them, so just kind of ignore that factor. The second thing I need to cover is that all of the garments I'm going to be wearing are examples of the time period. They are not the end-all be-all. There are plenty of different variations and options worn by different people. Most of what I'm going to be focusing on is going to be England-centric, just because that's what I have in my closet and that is what I am the most familiar with. There would be variations throughout the regions and variations throughout the different classes and types of people that you're dealing with as well. So there are just too many styles to cover all of them. This is a great sampling though. The third thing I need to cover is, what is underwear? We kind of define it today by something that is hidden below your clothing. It's the stuff that should not be seen. It is the private clothing. Granted, there are certainly fashions today where showing off some lingerie is the trend, but in general, we think of it as that's meant to go beneath clothing. In reality, underwear, undergarments, are going to be defined differently in different eras, and they'll all have different purposes. Some things will be supportive, some things will adjust the body, make it larger, make it smaller, give you the fashionable silhouette. Some things are going to be intentionally visible or invisible, and it's going to change throughout all of time. A lot of it comes down to, however, needing to be the layer between you and your outer clothing. It is a protective layer, whether that is protecting your clothing from you sweating and body oils and all sorts of other stuff, or protecting you from itchy, scratchy, abrasive clothing. There's a whole variety of different reasons to have that mid-layer between the two. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on. So that means that my definition for today for underwear is going to be whatever is closest to the skin. That one layer or a couple of pieces that are meant to be right up against the body. We're not going to be dealing with all of the extra layers that go on top, so if you want to see more about corsets, I have a video that's 100 years of corsets. If you want to know more about the transition from 18th century stays into 19th century corsets, I have a video on that as well. And if you want to know more about how structures, petticoats, bustles, hip pads, and all that sort of stuff built out the body in order to get the right ideal shapes, Abby has a wonderful video all about butts throughout history, and there are honestly so many other garments that could require their own videos of this format. But in order to keep this succinct, we're just sticking to that closest layer. And the fourth thing I need to cover is that today we have a lovely sponsor for our video, Care Of. Care Of is a subscription service that ships high-quality, personalized vitamins to your door every month. I've tried so often to figure out a system of vitamins that fills the gaps in my life, but it can feel extremely overwhelming when looking at all the options and not knowing what's going to work best for my goals. Finding time to do the hours of research is daunting, but with Care Of, they do the research with you. You start by taking an in-depth quiz about your goals, and they give you personalized recommendations. Each result comes with a thorough description so you can understand how it fits into your life. And it's simple to amend and update your packs to match your changing lifestyle. Fun fact, I am actually a morning person, but I tend to wear down by midday. And I know that I am not doing nearly enough in terms of my nutrition to help with that. So a set of vitamins custom fit to what my concerns and needs are is exactly what I need every morning. I've only been using Care of for a couple of weeks now, but I can definitely tell by afternoon if I forgot to take them. My favorite part is that everything is so conveniently wrapped up in a daily package, and the prompts are so much fun. Care of makes the complex process of managing to research and source and remember to take your daily vitamins so simple. They talk at length about what goes into every option, so you know that what you're putting in your body is made from good for you, clean ingredients. Go take Care of's quiz to find out what's recommended for you. Use my code NicoleR50 for 50% off of your first order, and you can make one thing in your daily self-care just that much easier. Thanks again to Care of for sponsoring this week's video. And now that we have everything important covered, let's travel back to the 15th century. We're starting off with the smock. This garment is a fairly simple shape. It is that way because it's easier to make. It doesn't need to be complicated and fitted, and the shapes that it's made out of are very economical when it comes to fabric usage. There's almost no waste in fabric when you're cutting entirely squares, rectangles, and triangles. This is a theme that will continue well into the 19th century. This garment is very similar in cut to the garments that go over it, such as the kirtle. It's going to mimic that style because you don't want a bunch of bulk underneath tight areas, and you don't want it super tight fitting in areas where you need a lot of movement. So that means it's going to be snugly fitted about the shoulders, loose around the rest of the body, going down to usually somewhere around mid-calf to the knee area, because you don't need the full length. By the time you reach below the knee, you have hose there, and in later eras you'll have petticoats as well, so you don't need coverage in that area so much. It's more concerning to have it in the torso area and around the upper body and arms, where again you not only want to protect the outer garments from needing to be laundered nearly as much, as well as making sure that you are protected from the textiles and tight sleeves, especially if it's an itchy wool or something like that. So it makes sense that this garment has the same open neckline as the garments it's intended to go under, has the same general styling. One of the only additional pieces is that of gussets under the arm. This is something that you'll see throughout, just because it's a really useful little piece. That means you have a little bit more movement in your arms. Nothing's going to be choking up underneath your arms because that's a pretty sensitive area. So this general cut is the style that you're going to see as the basis for the next few centuries. It is made out of a white bleached linen, and that's definitely the most common as well. Wool undergarments do exist, however, they tend to be more for specific medical purposes when it comes to, say, needing extra warmth. But linen does really well at wicking away the moisture and sweat and keeping you dry. It stays cool to the touch, so even with lots of heavy layers of wool, you're not going to be sweating and overheated and unable to let your skin really breathe because of your undergarments. So linen is the preferred option. White is the preferred color because it can be bleached and scoured and boiled and so many things done to it to get it clean, because you're going to wear, hopefully, optimally, that garment for the one day and that goes into the wash pile. This is not the situation with everyone, of course, but it is meant to be the garment that keeps constantly being cleaned and cleaned really hard. So white makes sense because, like I said, you can bleach it and then it will not only be clean, but it will really look clean. It's a sign of cleanliness, which is a sign of health, even as far back as the 15th century. There are certainly unbleached linens that are common, but they're chosen because they're less expensive, and so the ideal and the standard is white linen. Now, this smock is the only thing that I'm going to consider undergarments in this time period. There is nothing that goes underneath of this in the lower half when it comes to the typical fashions. There are always going to be oddball archaeological things, but in general, there's little to no evidence for anything else being worn as a sense of underwear other than this smock. So we're going to take the smock and move it forward about 100 years, going into the 16th century, and this is where something interesting happens. It becomes visible. The neckline rises up from being about the same open shape as the kirtles to being a collared style, usually with a little ruffle. Same thing goes with the cuffs. They're fuller sleeves, so they're gathered into a cuff, again commonly with little ruffles, and these cuffs and collars can be left plain or they can be smocked, they can be embroidered, they can have all sorts of extra work and effort done to them because they're visible. So this is an undergarment that is meant to be seen. They add in lace and all sorts of other expensive textiles and efforts so that way it visibly looks fashionable. It is part of the ensemble and it is expected to be seen. So underwear, not always hidden, even far back in the past. As we move into the 17th century, this trend continues, though the styles do change. Midway through the century, the bodices change the neckline and sleeve shape, so it's a very off-the-shoulder sort of look, large, full sleeves that are relatively short in comparison to a lot of the earlier decades. And the smock matches up with this. It too has a very large and open neckline, though it is very often visible around the edge of the bodice, just a little bit of extra fullness sort of ruffling around the edge there. Same thing goes with the sleeves. They are very large and full. Sometimes they are gathered down to a cuff or to another ruffle, and sometimes they're left very large and folded back and pinned up to the sleeves of the bodice. This style again is meant to be visible in quite a few locations, so it is really important to keep it clean, keep it white and bright, and occasionally it will be decorated with some extra expenses such as lace. Moving into the 18th century, however, the now called shift starts to disappear underneath the clothing. Those ruffles that we could visibly see around all the edges are still there, but they have detached themselves from the undergarment and are now attached directly to the gown or jacket. They are made up on their own and then just simply very loosely stitched in so they can be easily removed for cleaning. But as for the shift, it usually is fairly plain, big open neckline because the gowns have a fairly open neckline. The sleeves start off still pretty full at the beginning of the century because gown sleeves are rather large, and they will continue to narrow as sleeves continue to narrow throughout the 18th century. As for the body, it hasn't really changed in all of these centuries. It's still that basic trapezoid shape, fitted up at the shoulders and loose down to just below the knees. There's no reason to change what works under so many different eras. As we move into the early 19th century, not much changes there. The sleeves do shorten and sometimes disappear entirely just because of the style of the gowns that it's going under. So you don't want it visibly sticking out in weird places, so it's going to have to shrink as the gown styles do. Interestingly enough, this era really does feel like it has the least coverage in many ways of all of the eras we looked at in terms of clothing, just because there's not a lot of structure, there's not a lot of heaviness to it, but of course the weather has not really kept up. So if you're finding yourself a tidbit chilly with just the single layers that you've got, you can always add in a few extra things, such as a pair of drawers. This is when something underneath that shift or smock does come into play more commonly. Drawers, or sometimes called pantalettes, were becoming popular at the beginning portion of the 19th century, and they do offer warmth. They're also there for fashion purposes and a little bit of modesty just in case everything is really sheer, but that's not seemingly as often the concern. Interestingly enough, the thing about drawers in this time is that they are split drawers. That means that they are two separate legs. They might be attached around the waistband together, but sometimes they are separately tied about the waist. And the important thing is they aren't connected anywhere else. So that entire seam running from front all the way under to back is left open, because then you don't have to remove them to deal with your daily activities. This is just a practical thing. These are getting put on usually underneath a lot of your other garments, and they're going to go underneath the corset, underneath the petticoats, underneath all sorts of things that are tied about the waist. They're going to be difficult to remove and put back on, so you need to still be able to function. And these split drawers will continue in that manner throughout the rest of the 19th century. As for the shift, we have now started transition to what we call the chemise. This is not necessarily because it is a dramatically different garment. There are still chemises in the 1830s that really resemble the shift of the 18th century. However, they just kind of like French names at this time. It's just, you know, more cool, I guess. So the chemise in this era that is coming into being and transitioning out of the earlier style of T-shaped shift is because we're getting back to that off-the-shoulder style with gowns. And again, the full sleeves, they kind of go hand in hand in a lot of cases. And unlike the 17th century, where having a loose, blousy undergarment that would otherwise, once it's off the shoulders, just simply slump down and be really hard to keep up on your shoulders and in place, they're instead not going to have it pull up over the edges of the bodice to hold the armscye and that stuff into place. They're going to depend on a yoke, and that is that fitted band of fabric around the top edge that usually buttons in order to keep it snug to the body, and that means it's going to stay supported, but you can gather your body and your sleeves into it so that way there's enough room for movement. You're not going to be super tight the whole way down the body, just at that one point that you need the support. Everything else gets gathered in, still fairly full. The sleeves are generally shorter just because there are a lot of fashionable styles that have fairly short sleeves. And this style will continue well through the 1860s until the neckline starts to change. It's also around this time that we start to see a major transition in a few other features of underwear. A lot of these shifts are coming around because of the Industrial Revolution. Machines are making everything cheaper and easier. So fabric is less expensive, and in the case of cotton, it really heavily depended on a lot of features of the Industrial Revolution, not just machines, but also the massive growth of slavery in the United States at the beginning part of the 19th century. And all of these things mean that cotton is cheaper, it's more available, and therefore it's also pretty fashionable. And it's not the better option for undergarments. In fact, it really isn't. It doesn't deal with moisture nearly as well or body temperature, but it still can be washed and cleaned and bleached. So it works pretty well as an undergarment fabric and becomes incredibly popular because of all the factors of the time. Additionally, we also have the sewing machine, which means that all of these garments are being able to be made much faster. And that also means they're adding in a lot more detail. Whereas before things were hand-stitched and it made sense to stick with really simple straight edges, you didn't need to be complicated. It took a lot of time to make these things anyway because you wanted fine stitching so it lasted a long time. Instead, the machines can speed through that really fast, and suddenly we want to start adding more decoration. We want to start adding a little more lace, a little more detail, a little bit of embroidery, a little bit of pizzazz, even though these aren't visible. Unlike the 16th century, when they added their pizzazz, they put it out for show. The 19th century keeps it tucked away. And so as we move into the 1880s, you're seeing more and more lace added to these garments. You're seeing more and more ruffles and fluff and really unnecessary things. My 1880s example is still made out of linen because you do still find linen occasionally, and I prefer it as an undergarment myself over cotton, so I held on as long as I possibly could to my linen when it comes to my collection. But I chose to go with the sleeveless style because sometimes I'm wearing it along with evening gowns, and in this era sometimes they're sleeveless. So I need to be able to drop that out of the way. It simply unties at the shoulders and it drops down over the corset, and then I don't have to worry about it slipping out and being visible anywhere around my shoulders. Which means, of course, that we've started to change our concepts of what underwear is doing, just a little bit. It's still being a protective layer between the body and the corset and the gown to some extent, but now suddenly our armpits are free and sweaty. So this is also when a few changes take place. First off, we've already talked about the fact that things are cheaper to make and faster to make. This really is the origination of fast fashion as we know it. I did a whole video about that as well. And there's an expectation that you might not wear these garments nearly as much, so sweating into them, whatever. There's also a lot of washable garments that are coming into existence. They're losing some of the extra structure and extra fluff, so that way they become washable. They're more simple in their style. And you also have dress shields, which I think is something that we really need to bring back. It's just a little piece of fabric, and usually that inner layer that sits over the armpit area of your bodice and protects it from you, and you can pull them out, wash them separately, or throw them away and replace them when they are one of the disposable styles that come later on. And this idea of the undergarments not really doing everything they were originally intended to do and instead becoming a bit more superfluous is going to continue from here on out. We're just going to keep coming up with new inventions to replace the things that it was already doing for us. We're just new inventions. They're great, right? So when we get to the 1890s and early 1900s, have one of my favorite pieces that I've made, but one of the most fluffy and really in so many ways absolutely pointless pieces. This is what they call combinations. That's because we've taken the chemise and those drawers and combined them together. Now that part is quite functional. It means that they didn't have two things around their waist. It really allows you to get rid of the bulk in that area. It allows you to get rid of the bulk around your legs, even though this style does have a lot of ruffles. As we get into the early 20th century, the gowns are going to slim down. You're going to want less and less bulk there. So 2 layers versus 1 layer kind of can make a difference. But you'll notice this is out of a very lightweight cotton lawn. It's not doing a lot to protect whatever is going over it. It does cover the portion of the body where the corset will sit, but it's full of lace and it's just got lace straps. It's not doing a lot to put a barrier between me and my exterior clothing. It's fluffy and pretty. And to hand stitch all that would have been a lot of extra work, but to machine stitch it, it actually goes surprisingly fast. So we're adding in all of these ribbons and lace and extra fluff and frills because we can. Why not? Suddenly fashion over form is an option for undergarments in the way that it really wasn't before. And as we move further into the 20th century, the gowns simplify at the beginning of the 19-teens, they slim down, the undergarments that need to go under them also slim down, we get rid of ruffles and move towards pleats, we get rid of all the gathers and drawstrings around the bodices and move towards things that are seamed and darted, things that are shaped and fitted to the body. We're really not utilizing our fabric in the same way that we used to be. We're not trying to make the most of our yardage. We're cutting weird shapes out to get this. But it's a matter of the modern concept of we have plenty and we can do more with this. And so even though these garments are slimming down and simplifying, they're still putting in plenty of lace. They're still putting plenty of detail and decor into them. Even for the simple ones, they might still have embroidery to finish off the edges or a little bit of a floral style in front just for some added pizzazz, even if they are out of a fairly heavy cotton. And with this pretty equal importance placed over form and function, we move into the late 19-teens and early 1920s, which is in many ways the birth of our modern fashion. And boy, it gets colorful really fast. That's because no longer are we relying on just linen and cotton as our basic undergarment materials. We have also added silk and rayon, which is just faux silk. This wasn't as much of an option before, though little bits of silk such as the ribbons or the petticoats, things like that, would often be in silk. We didn't use it before because most of the options that we had were stiff and crisp taffetas, things that you didn't want up against your body and things that honestly weren't terribly washable. But the crepe weave that is popularized in the early 20th century for things like georgette and chiffon really takes off, and it's pretty washable without losing your luster or your texture, and it means you can do brilliant, bright, wonderful colors that weren't necessarily the easiest options on cotton or linen, just because sometimes they don't dye nearly as bright and vivid. And while colorful undergarments certainly existed in the past, they were seen as more of a novelty. They weren't something that was the standard fashion. And so it's terribly interesting to see this absolute explosion of color in this era that is still paired with lace and ribbons and trims, all of these things that will never be seen outside of the garments. Because as the outer clothing is simplifying, it doesn't have the same structure, it doesn't have the same coverage as before, the undergarments too need to be less bulky, need to have less coverage. So many of them, such as the step-ins or the cami knickers or teddies or all sorts of different names that they have for these garments, are just going to hit below the hips and just above the bust. They're going to cover the parts of the body that will need a corset or girdle or some other support on top, and that's about it. In the case of my step-in, I do have buttons in the crotch area, so that way that can be opened up and dealt with, but if they are loose enough, you can also pull that to the side. So while these garments are not meant to be easily removed and put back on, as they will be under corsets and garments and things like that, they are still meant to be functional, at least in that format. This is also the point where that lower garment is becoming more like shorts. They are sometimes called knickers, they have a bunch of different names as well, but they are kind of developing into what we consider our modern day underwear. This is just an earlier state of it. And this is also the point where we're developing the modern day brassiere. Bust supports had existed prior to this point. Corsets, they started dropping down lower and lower at the end of the 19th century, so bust support had to pick up. This is something that is still worn over that innermost layer, so I wasn't really considering it underwear up until this point. If you look at 19-teens, you will still see that the brassieres are worn on top of these camisoles and other undergarments, but as we transition into the 1920s, that starts to change, and you see more and more examples of the brassiere and those knickers being worn underneath a slip. So you have an option which way you want to wear it, but it's starting to change as of the 1920s, and that's because the dresses are changing. Suddenly you have a lot of sheer, lightweight, and see-through options. You need something in between your body and the outer garment that is going to be opaque and hide everything. And that's going to include hiding the brassiere or the knickers or the camisole or whatever goes underneath. So this is where the slip comes into play as not quite the same thing as what we considered an undergarment previously. It is a mid-layer, but now the garments underneath of it can depend on what the person needs. They might still choose to have a camisole or cami knickers or combination step-ins, whatever. They might also just choose to have a brassiere and knickers with nothing else underneath of those. And that's really what we start to see more and more commonly as we get into the 1930s, is just the separate brassiere and knickers as the actual undergarments with a slip on top, which functions much like the chemise used to, but can also be a visual addition to the garment, so that way your underwear, as we now think of it, is hidden from outer view. And so that's how we get to the version that we have today. There are of course still plenty of garments that are used throughout the different decades of the 20th century. Those innermost garments don't entirely disappear, because even though the brassiere might be the closest thing to the skin, if you're wearing, say, a garter belt or a girdle, you might not want that directly up against your body, and in some cases it is more practical to actually put the knickers over it, because then you can pull them down really easily. Rather than trying to pull them out from underneath a tight girdle or a garter belt, it's easier sometimes to just go over. And as we move further into the century, they will get smaller, tighter, more elasticated, because we're moving into the era of women wearing tight skirts and trousers, and you can't fit a whole lot of bulk into a lot of those garments, so you need undergarments that are even more tightly fitted. But both the brassiere and the knickers in their own formats are going to stick around. The slip does also stick around, though it goes in and out of fashion as to whether it's being used or not. But in reality, once we've reached that 1920s point, it starts to look pretty familiar to our modern eye. And with all of that, we can see the general slow transition through all of these different centuries to get us to where we are today. In reality, there are so many variations on all of these, which will change depending on the person and their needs, what their body needs in terms of support or coverage, what their outer garments need in terms of protection, and we will continue to shift and change our modern styles as well.